Well, I think we should just get going because I'm sure there's way more content than time. If our other other meeting was any indication, right? Um, so I just want to, I'm sure more people are going to hop on. In fact, here's another one, two more people. So I'll just keep on letting them come in as we get started.
Sure.
But um, so I just want to introduce to you all Matt Reichert or Matthew Reichert, who is hailing right now from where in Minnesota?
I am in the Diocese of St. Cloud, so I'm not too far from Collegeville, Minnesota, if you know where that is.
Okay, great. So I first heard him at a church music convention, actually. He was doing a presentation on volunteer recruitment and other trends in the church, which I found very interesting and beyond kind of like the usual recruitment kind of advice that you hear. And just thought it was very relevant to our organization. And so I'm grateful that he's willing to work with us and learn about all things Society of St. Vincent de Paul. um, I'll just let you kind of continue with a little bit more about yourself, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna share my screen just so we get used to the view here. Can uh Terry, because I can see you, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen? Okay, perfect, great. Well, thanks everybody. So as Gail mentioned, my name is Matt Reichert. I work for a couple of Catholic organizations. My primary work is with OCP, Oregon Catholic Press, and I head up OCP's division called the Center for Learning. And this part of OCP, OCP is a publisher and primarily a music publisher, but we support liturgical life in parishes. And the Center for Learning side supports all things ministry development and ministry formation. So we do a lot of classes, we do a lot of workshops, we do a lot of webinars, retreats, um, trying to find ways to make ministry in the church and ministers in the church serve more confidently and effectively. Just knowing how much things have changed lately in the landscape of the church in the United States and just culture in general. So that's the lens through which I'm joining you today, is on behalf of the Center for Learning, but also to really kick off a couple of opportunities for us to be together. And today I'm going to go back here a slide. We're looking at a couple of topics, but in particular, we're looking at this concept of generational diversity. And I'll say more about this in a minute, but we're at a point in the church and in society where we have active members, that active participants who are members of six, or some would say seven, generations all at once. This is the time of the most active generational diversity ever. And there are some really interesting challenges and opportunities that come along with that, especially for parishes, schools, and member organizations. So that's the lens through which we'll be talking about generational diversity tonight. I want to give you a real quick overview of what I'm hoping to accomplish tonight. But before that, what I'd like to do, and it can always be a little tricky with virtual meetings like this, I'm going to put up two questions that I want you to think about for a few seconds. And then we'll take a couple of volunteers who are willing to share your responses. But first, I'm going to give you a little bit of time to think about it, okay? So let me get both of these questions out, and then I'll ask maybe for two volunteers for each question. And in this context, knowing that a variety of you might have different roles, different responsibilities, different ministries, let's consider your answers to these two questions related to St. Vincent de Paul Society. Okay, so you again serving your parish in another way, let's keep it to the society for these two questions. So they are: one, how do you explain to people what you do? Like if we're at a cocktail party, or we're on an elevator, or on a plane somewhere, right? And I ask you what you do, how do you explain that to me? And the second question is, what's your ministry vocation story? Like, meaning, how, thanks to whom did you first get involved on whatever path led you to your current role? Okay, so just take 15 seconds, think about your response. How do you explain to people what you do? What's your ministry vocation story? Then, what I'd like to do is take just a couple of examples, maybe two for each one of these questions, just in interest of time. But I encourage you to come back to these questions sometime when you have more time, because I'm sure everybody's responses to both of these questions would be really interesting. But can I get a brave volunteer who's willing to unmute and give us their response to that first question? How do you explain to people what you do? Maybe we don't, maybe we're
Come
trying
on,
to figure
Madison
out
folks,
where
let's
we're
go.
clapping at you. Go ahead, Gail.
Oh, me. Okay. Well, um, let's see. I will say that the answer to the first question is very challenging for me in a social networking situation. As I discussed, the whole 15-second rule doesn't seem to cut it. The closest I've been able to get to is I am the membership director for the Society of St. Vincent de Paul and Madison. We do a number of things, from home visits to food pantry to charitable pharmacy things. Basically, the society is a giant international worldwide club with small groups, and I help coordinate those small groups, help form them, educate them, offer them resources, connect them to the larger organization. And then there's a bit of a blank stare because they just think of thrift stores when it comes to our organization, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, you're proving the point, right? Like we can, from moment to moment, day to day. Well, not that there aren't times when I'm sure you yourself sit there and think, what is it I do? What am I doing? Right.
Yeah, yeah,
But from moment to moment, day to day in all of our ministry, we can feel so connected to it. We could feel like we've got our arms around it. And all it
yeah,
takes is someone to say, what do you do? And then I'm at a loss of how do I quantify it, right?
yeah.
I know you're not all membership coordinators, but anybody else, we'll take one more person. Want to add anything to how you explain what you do? We're all at a loss. Perfect. I got you right where I want you. How about that second one then? I'm expecting folks to rise to the second question then. Someone tell me your ministry vocation story. How'd you first get connected with the society? What was your start?
How did you get in your conferences or become a home visitor?
Yeah, thank you for translating.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's good.
I can respond.
Yeah, thanks, Terry.
So I actually saw an ad in my bulletin at church that piqued my interest, and I sent
Yeah.
I'm a staff member, so I sent my resume. And it was actually right about this time, and I didn't hear back until after the 1st of January, and I just had kind of written it off.
Mm.
And then when I came in for the first interview, they're like, well, we are a Catholic organization. We're a little busy in November and December. And I was like, oh, okay. But then just kind of fell in love with the mission and had a fabulous mentor
Mm.
in Jim Claffey, and just kind of learned to love the society. And I've been here now 13 years.
Wow, that's great. Thanks, Terry. Thanks for sharing.
Great.
One more person? Anyone else want to go? Gail didn't want to go and she turned her
Oh,
camera off. She disappeared.
I meant to mute myself. I'm
No,
sorry.
that's okay. No, that's fine. I love hearing, Terry, your example of seeing something in the bulletin, lest people think bulletins are dead. This last weekend, I was at the National Catholic Youth Conference, and in one of my workshops, there was one of the newest members. He was just ordained and made final vows in the Claretian ministries. And he's from a part of the country that has no Claretian presence whatsoever. And so I asked him, how the heck did you get connected with the Claretians? And he said liked their ad in a vocation magazine he got in the mail and called him up and then joined the Claretians. And I thought, if anybody thinks print ads and print publishing is dead, there we have Terry's story and this Claretian story all within 48 hours. Okay, so part of the point of the conversation here is to illustrate that oftentimes, and maybe as you were thinking about your responses to these questions, I'm guessing this isn't universal for all of us, but typically what I experience is we have a harder time with our response to the first question than we do with our response to the second question. And I think there's something important in that to consider, that certainly what we do in our ministry is important because of the fruit that it bears, because of the service that it provides, for all of the reasons. What we do, that output is important. But I think what's most effective and what's most appealing and what's most energizing, and in fact, maybe you could even say most inspiring, is the vocation story, how we got connected and how it's kept its claws in us, or how we haven't been able to let it go because it's become a part of us. Expressing and communicating our vocation oftentimes comes more naturally to us and means more to the listener than how we try to explain what we do. And I think there's going to be some interesting implications for that later in our conversations. So given all this, here's what I'd like to cover today, and the extent to which we get there, and we might have to come back to emphasize some of these things later, or other questions will come up, or you'll think of questions after tonight. And we can circle back to them next time. But I want to think about the realities and the opportunities that generational diversity presents to wherever it is you are at work in the society. So again, you all have different roles. You're all in supporting the organizational mission in different ways. All of us have some challenges or limitations, the realities that generational diversity presents. It's harder to get new volunteers. It's harder to get new members. It's harder to get engagement with members of perhaps Generation XYZ. But at the same time, I think there are significant opportunities within generational diversity that means we need to keep trying and keep chipping away and keep taking new steps towards engaging members of a variety of generations. So to do that, to apply these realities, that's our objective. So I want to talk a little bit about age diversity, generational diversity, where it comes from, why we have generational diversity to begin with, why people of different ages don't have similar approaches, similar preferences. So I want to talk about that a little bit, and then look at some trends that we see in generational experience to try to do some perspective taking with members of different generations. We'll talk a little bit about generational profiles, and then maybe talk about some concepts or some suggestions that might help us, again, in whatever our role is, take some generational perspective to take advantage of the opportunities that generational diversity presents. I will also say that all of the things that I'm going to talk about tonight are, again, they're rooted in generational research. So this would apply to trends that you might confront in your work with a society, or also just with your neighbors, with your fellow parishioners, with other people you work with or volunteer with. So there's going to be more implications here as we work our way along. Okay. So given all of that, what I'd like to do is we are going to take a second just to pray to start our time off. And so I'd ask, wherever you are joining from, if you take a moment just to quiet your heart, quiet your mind, quiet your body, as we enter into this time of learning together, as we enter into this time of virtual community, as we dedicate this next hour or so to better serving our brothers and sisters, serving the society, serving the church. And so to begin, we're going to use a prayer. It's one of my favorites. It has been used at many gatherings internationally, locally, since it was first widely shared at the opening of the Second Vatican Council. But this is the Ad Sumus Sancte Spiritus prayer. So we pray. We stand before you, Holy Spirit, as we gather together in your name. With you alone to guide us, make yourself at home in our hearts. Teach us the way we must go and how we are to pursue it. Let us find in you our unity so that we may journey together to eternal life and not stray from the way of truth and what is right. All this we ask of you, who are at work in every place and time, in the communion of the Father and the Son, forever and ever. Amen. Okay. So picture this. I'm going to give you a scenario to imagine. And then we're going to pick this story apart a little bit. So imagine I'm not joining you virtually, right? Imagine we're all together. I know we'll have an opportunity to gather in person in a few months. So imagine we're all together, and after all of this learning, after all of this time, I decide I am going to plan an evening of fun and community building for all of us, right? Now, I'm a high-functioning introvert. So whenever anyone says, I'm going to plan an evening of fun and community building, I start to get a little bit of the cold sweats a little. But imagine I'm going to say, great, I'm going to take you all out for a fun evening so we get to know each other better. And here are my goals. My goals for the evening are threefold. One, I want us to enjoy some refreshments while we build community, get to know each other, right? So I want us to be able to mingle in groups or pairs and have some good conversation. That's my first goal. My second goal is I want to help support you and your physical well-being by feeding you, right? Food is always great. Food's always a great connector. So I want to provide some tasty food. And then finally, because we've been working, because we've been learning, this is a busy time of year, I want to be able to offer some sort of fun activity so that we can have a good time and sort of mentally unplug. Okay, so those are my three goals. My big objective, I want an evening of fun and community building. So we're going to have refreshments to build community. We're going to nourish our bodies with tasty food, and we're going to participate in a fun activity. So after doing all of that and all of that planning, here's the plan I came up with. We are going to enjoy lime margaritas. We are going to enjoy tasty fried chicken, and we're going to go to Cowabunga Bay Water Park. Right? It's going to be great. You're going to love it, right? So that's how I'm choosing to meet my three goals. Margaritas, lime margaritas, fried chicken, Cowabunga Bay, right? Now, the question is, who would be excluded from meeting my goals for that evening or that afternoon activity if that was all that was provided? If I didn't provide any alternative options to lime margaritas, fried chicken, Cowabunga Bay Water Park. So just think about that for a second. Who would be excluded? What would the barriers be to meeting my goals for that afternoon if that's all that was offered? And then consider, given who would be excluded or the ways they'd be excluded, what could we change or adjust or adapt to better achieve these three goals for the party? Again, I want us to enjoy refreshments and build community, socialize, mingle. I want us to eat something, and I want us to have some sort of fun participatory activity. Margaritas, fried chicken, water park. Give me some examples. What could we change to better achieve the goals of this party? What would you recommend?
A non-alcoholic drink for those that are on medications or cannot drink alcohol.
Sure, yeah. I mean, some sort of additional, either a substitute completely or at least some sort of other offering, something that's not alcoholic. I mean, for all of the reasons that you mentioned, some of us might not be able to drink. Some of us, maybe there's somebody who's pregnant, right? There could be somebody who's driving from a far distance. There could be all sorts of reasons why having a non-alcoholic option would be preferable. So that would be an easy change because a bunch of people, and your answer already alluded to this, someone who's on medication, someone who doesn't drink, someone who can't drink, someone who's pregnant, all of those folks would otherwise be excluded, right? What other changes could we make here? Doesn't have to be a big change.
Well, not everybody can go to a water park that's more geared for little children, families.
Sure.
Um,
Or some of us don't, the thought of going to a water park just sounds awful. I mean, it could be really fun. Maybe it's a great fun, but not in November, likely. And I would much rather go someplace else where maybe there were more opportunities that we don't all have to put on our swimsuits and hop in the pool, right? So something that would be more accessible to people, not only in terms of, you know, if they're bringing their families, supervisory things, whatever, but maybe I can't swim, not comfortable, whatever it might be, right? And then that middle one, it's fried chicken. What if I'm gluten intolerant? Or what if I don't eat meat? Or maybe we should have something other than just fried chicken. I'm told, my wife is in healthcare, I'm told there's a food pyramid and that fried chicken does not constitute an entire well-balanced meal. So we should have something else, some other sort of diversity of food, right? The point of all this is to say that oftentimes there can be unintended consequences, unintended barriers, despite the carefully intentioned goals, the carefully laid plans that we might make, and some simple, some accessible adjustments might broaden the net, broaden the reach, and the impact of the goals that we've set for ourselves, right? That this applies to all of us individually, in terms of our ministries, in terms of our organizations, that there are some adaptations available to us that, if we think about them, don't really substantively at all change our goals or our objectives, but certainly widen the net in terms of folks that we're able to involve in our overall objective and our overall mission. I'm going to give you some examples of applying this fake scenario to actual organizational change as we work our way through here. But the point is, again, none of the changes that we suggested takes anything away from our overall objective and our overall goal, but it does make the chance of success significantly higher. So given all of that, and again, I'm going to talk about what that means for organizational change and adaptation in a second, but I want to go back, because we're going to apply this to generational diversity. I want to go back to that first element of our agenda to talk about where generational diversity comes from, where age diversity comes from to begin with, right? So a couple of disclaimers about generational research. One is generational research falls in the social sciences. It falls in the soft sciences, which means there could be some discrepancy around terminology or labels or definitions. So why I say that is, when you look at this list of 6 generations alive and active today, these may be labels for generations that you're familiar with, or you might be used to calling them something different, right? And so anyway, there could be some discrepancy. Also, there can be some discrepancy in terms of labeling when a generation begins. I will out myself as a member of the millennial generation. I was born in 1982. And so in this definition, I'm just across the line of millennials. In some generational researchers, they put the beginning of the millennial generation in 1980, some of them even as early as 1978. It's all approximate, right? So the groupings are going to shift a little bit. Also, generational research is general. So we're looking at trends in behavior, trends in attitudes, trends in preferences, but it's not deterministic. Meaning, when I start talking about Generation Z, because Generation Z, I'm going to choose as a focus, as the example generation for our conversation this evening. You might know people, you might be related to people, you might be raising someone who's born between 1996 and 2010 who doesn't fit the general description. Remember, this is generic for the group of people who was born during this time frame. It's not determinative, right? I mentioned before, this is the time of the greatest generational diversity that we've experienced, at least certainly in modern history or on record. The actual distance between generations is starting to get smaller. And you can even see that just in terms of the generations that are listed here. The number of years between generation shifts from closer to 20 to now, actually, after Generation Alpha, we're looking at the rise of Generation Beta and Generation Alpha. Again, it's going to take a while to bear this out, but we imagine that that generation might only have about 8 to 10 years of a time span, as opposed to the 15 years or so that millennials have had. A lot of that has to do with the fact that we look at the causes of a shift in a generation. For a while, researchers thought it was because of a major event that happened during that generation's lifetime that left an impact. So if you look at the silent generation, it's the Great Depression and it's World War II. Look at the baby boomer generation, it's the great expansion of business after World War II and the Cold War, right? Beginning as of Vietnam. If you look at Gen X, it's getting closer to the fall of communism, right? Or later Cold War era, right? Millennial generation, it's the internet age and it's the fall of communism. It's the new millennium. So again, we look at sometimes researchers will say it's a major event that triggers that departure. Really, what new research is suggesting is that it's actually impact of technology and impact of different ways of living, changes in the way we live, that spins off a new generation. And certainly technology, popular culture is changing so fast that our generations are actually getting shorter. Point being, after all of that, what is important for you to take away is, again, the fact that there are many generations, 6, maybe 7, active, alive in our societies right now. We all, again, have different preferences or differences in our preferences, our attitudes, our outlook, our experiences, and that shapes the way that we behave. The challenge, especially in ministry, especially in an organization like yours, is that you're tasked with interacting with and serving members of all of these generations with 6 different viewpoints, but it's just you. You have one mission, right? You have one organization. You have a way of being. You have your own culture. The challenge is, how do you bring people from multiple generations in? How do you interface with members of multiple generations at the same time? So we'll start to scratch into that a little bit. Each of these generations, I mentioned before, again, the theory that there are major events that happen, but there are really 3 sources of or contributing factors to age diversity. One of them is life cycle effects. So we have age diversity because young people differ from older people, but may resemble them later in life. Meaning, my daughter, my oldest daughter, turned 13 yesterday. She is now 13 in the year 2024. I turned 13 in 1995. My grandfather, who my daughter knew very well, my grandfather was born in 1929. That means that he turned 13 in 1942. There is something similar, my grandfather, me, and my daughter's experience of being 13. All of you, we were all 13 once, right? There's something about being 13 we all shared in common, though there's also something about that period when we turned 13 that's going to differ. Being 13 in 1942 versus 1995 versus 2024 is going to affect us a little differently. So we have some things in common, given the shared experience of being 13. But we also have some differences because we turned 13 in different periods of history. When I was 13 in 1995, we just got, I think it was that Christmas, maybe it was a year later, maybe it was when I was 14, that we just got AOL and dial-up internet. And my high school, or my middle school at the time, I had 360 kids in my 7th grade class. And I was AOL Instant Messenger friends with all of my classmates who had the internet at home. And there were 4 of us out of the 360 some kids in 1995. My daughter today in 2024 is one of the few kids in her class who doesn't have her own cell phone, smartphone, right? So again, quick change. And then the final source of age diversity is that cohort or generational effects, right? So that means that different events in history, different influences of technology cause trends or cause different experiences of trends that can help shape a whole group or cohort of people right as they're at their most developmental. For example, my grandfather turning 13, I'm just picking 13 just as an example age. My grandfather turning 13 in 1942, growing up during the Great Depression, and 1942 very much being towards the beginning of the United States involvement in World War II, that type of experience had a contributing effect on the way that he viewed the world and lived his life the rest of his life, he and his friends, right? So again, we have these different types of trends, we have these different types of imprintings that happen that help cause these changes in experience, these changes in perspective, these changes in attitudes. Now, the last thing I want to say about this before I get into the things that will maybe be more interesting than this is it's important to note that it can be difficult, challenging, even frustrating to try to decode or relate to someone who's a member of a different generation than you, or someone who's a member of a generation that you don't know how to connect with effectively yet. But it's important to note that generational diversity isn't good or bad, it just is. Nobody is able to determine what time, what year or what point in history they are, what age they are, or what the major events or changes in technology around them might be that are going to influence them. So as frustrating as generational differences might be, I'm thinking of those of you with children or grandchildren who might be feeling this, it's not good or bad, it just is. And it's important for us to know these sources so we can have some more clear ways to interact with them, if that makes sense. Okay. I'm going to pause there. Any questions, any clarifications, anything that I said that would be helpful to address before we move on? Okay, let's pick up some time in the air here. I'm not going to ask you to share this. I just want you to mentally think about this, okay? Just by yourself. I want you to think about 10 events of higher significance. They have to be major events, but 10 significant national or larger, meaning not just your household or your town, events that took place between the time you were born and the time when you were 30 years old. Think of 10 events, whatever they might be. Again, I'm not going to ask you to share them. Just identify them. The reason I want you to do this is because, again, if we're thinking about sources of age diversity and the way our outlook and experiences are shaped by the context of as we're growing up and developing, it can be helpful for us to identify those own potential contributing factors for us to see how they might have influenced the way we or our friends or people of the same age might interact with or make sense of the world. What I'm showing you here, again, is not deterministic, but what I'm showing you here represents, this is not my research, this is a generational researcher out of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. who does a lot of work in this area. And what she's done is just to provide a demonstration for each generation, or 5 generations anyway, to demonstrate how in different categories down this column on the left, how different generations might react, respond, view that particular category, so that you get a sense of how some of these things change over time. And we can think about how those different sources of age diversity might contribute. So for example, take a look at role of relationship. So this is the second category. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not. And I don't want to click because I'm going to change the screen. But if you look at role of relationship, if you think about again, what this looks at is tries to categorize in general, for general trends for each generation, the role of interpersonal relationships, how someone's self-concept in relationship to others develops, right? And the importance of relationships on my happiness or on the way I make decisions throughout my life, personally, professionally, etc. In general, and again, this isn't deterministic, so this is a trend. It's not, doesn't mean that you have to be pigeonholed into this. But members of a silent generation, relationships are significant factors when making decisions, when looking at the world. Again, I don't want to sound like the way I'm categorizing this is judgmental or limiting in any sort of factor, but relationships were a lot more close-knit, important, closer to home prior to television, certainly before the internet, but prior to television, prior to the interstate highway system, prior to air travel, prior to a lot of the things that connected us far beyond the boundaries of our neighborhoods or our smaller towns. Eventually, when you move into a time period when business is expanding and international relations and diplomacy are expanding, it's not that relationships aren't important, but they have a more limited application when making bigger, broader decisions when it comes to business. We're looking at growing the company. We're looking at growing the corporation. We're looking at expanding internationally, and that might change the relationships from the small town where the factory was started, but now is moving overseas. And all the way to millennials, a relationship. When you look at the curriculum that was taught when we were in school, cultures and geography were significant. Middle school, high school, when we were connecting is when we first got the internet and we could have instant pen pals in different parts of the world, right? When high schools, it became more common to take international educational trips, right? So all of a sudden relationships became global. And I can think about the way that how I live in central Minnesota might impact someone who's living in West Africa, right? So again, different relational factors shift when it comes to different generations. View of the future. Silent generation seeks to stabilize the future because the world was torn apart at the time. Millennials, we tend to have an optimistic view of the future because we grew up during the 90s when there was a great expansion of the economy and a great global peace that happens, right? So again, different things that happen in our lives contributes to different trends and the way we see the world. So what I want to do to try to illustrate this a little bit more deeply, and then I promise we're going to talk about what the heck does this have to do with the society, what the heck does this have to do with an organization, and how we might think about how we serve people, how we engage people, how we grow in terms of those who work with the organization. There are a lot of different trend areas or social areas that we could look at trend information for a generation. I want to look at these 3 just as 3 areas to examine. I want to look at, for Generation Z, these are people alive today who were born 1996 to 2010 or so, right? So they would be 30 years old to 20 to 14 years old, right? Is that right? Whatever the math is, that during that period. I want to look at education, I want to look at parenting, and I want to look at faith and religion, okay? So what I'm about to show you are general realities that tend to be true for members of Generation Z who went through school or were being parented or were connected or not to organized religion. And we can think about, for whatever generation you're a member of, how does that compare or contrast to your experience of education, parenting, faith, and religion, okay? So let's start with education trends. Again, these are general trends, so it may or may not be true for people you know who were raised in this generation. First, school starts sooner, lasts longer, and does not include as much real life experience for members of this generation. So what does that mean? My children, let me go back. My grandfather, I'm going to use him a lot as examples just because he's a member of a very distinct generation from my children. When my grandfather went to school and went to the first grade, it was called first grade because that was the first grade that he had in school, right? So first grade, you're learning your letters, you're learning your phonics, you're learning handwriting, you're learning your colors, your numbers, shapes, all of that kind of stuff, right? In first grade. My children, my grandfather knew when they went to first grade, before that, and this is, I mean, we're blessed to have access to a variety of educational choice where we live, but this is the common trend where we are. This isn't the Reicherts were in a particular situation. This, what I'm about to describe, is the average, right, in terms of school participation for where we are. Before first grade, my children had a full year of kindergarten, 2 full years of preschool, and before that, 2 years, not full-time, not every day, of early childhood education. So from the time they were 1.5, they had some sort of intentional, educational, formational experience outside of the home or daycare. 5 years of time before first grade, compared to my grandfather's generation, which started first grade when they turned 6, right? So that's going to have certainly a significant effect. Similarly, my grandfather graduated from high school and got a job. In fact, he got a couple of jobs, right? Now, and this is not a judgment call, right? But now, on average, members of younger generations live at home longer. They can be on we can be on your parents' insurance till 26 now. That's a significant change. So school starts sooner, adolescence is delayed longer. That's going to have a significant trend. Certainly standardized tests, assessments have become a big reality in education. The type of education and formation that happens is much more collaborative. If you go into, and maybe some of you are educators or volunteer in schools, if you go into elementary school, middle school, high school classroom, you're more likely to find flexible seating, table groups, or even maybe not even desks, maybe there's other sort of variable seating, as opposed to individual desks in rows and columns, right? A lot more group projects, a lot more performance assessments, meaning instead of reading about something, writing a paper, you do a project or do a presentation. There's much more student-centered education, meaning when I was in the classroom, we would do a lot of assessments at the beginning to figure out where all of you are in process, so I can customize, Gail needs this, and Terry needs that, and Bob needs this. But also we figure out learning preferences. Some of you are kinesthetic learners, some of you are auditory learners, some of you are visual learners, and we have a mix of all of that, right? Different needs are being served. That's a trend, certainly. And definitely technology is everywhere, right? Teachers are sort of the switchboard, but not the font of knowledge. Most teachers would never do what I'm doing to you right now, which is just talking at you, right? There's all kinds of other coordinated education. So take a second and think about, how does this differ, or how does it sound similar to your own educational experiences? And think about, and I'm not going to ask you to share, but just think about, for these trends are real. what effect might these educational trends have in shaping attitudes, experience, behaviors for these students later in their life? So again, how does this compare or contrast to your experience? We're just thinking about this. How would this potentially leave an imprint on something else? Okay.
Matt, I just want to break in here for a second and
Yep.
give a little time reference. So it's about 7:30. So
Yep.
thanks for hanging in there, everybody. And yeah, just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're previewing the point of all this, which is to say, if this is the case, if these are the trends that are happening, if this is what's shaping somebody, and I realize I'm picking Generation Z here just because we need some sort of starting point or some sort of common group to look at. The point is that this is going to be a group of people who are going to view other organizations, jobs, responsibilities, support networks, relationships with supervisors, with neighbors, with volunteer organizations in a different way because they've been trained to, they've been formed to function or experience the world in a particular way, right? They haven't been brought up in the way maybe we have been, and that's not their fault, but as a result of the changes in trends, they view things differently and so are looking for different expectations. So let me show you what this means for an organization. I'm going to skip through parenting trends and I'm going to skip through faith trends other than to say, but what I want to say about faith trends because of how this impacts us is the largest religious group in the United States today are adults who claim no religious affiliation. There are more adults who are religiously disaffiliated than there are adults who are members of any other religious group. And the reason I mention that is not because I want to dwell on it or because it's maybe not something that we know, but the point of it is to say, there are, this quote from the American Religious Identification Survey, I think is really important. It's not that there are members of our society who are thinking about religion and rejecting it. They're not thinking about religion at all. What I mean by that is to say, we might take it for granted that members of a younger generation who we might be trying to recruit for participation or membership in our organization, that they might have had similar experiences or even the same type of viewpoints or attitudes that we've had, when in fact, they might not have had any sort of experience that relates to the assumption that we're making. There are a lot of adults my age and younger who don't know what the church teaches, who don't know about Catholic social teaching, who might not know much about organized religion whatsoever. And it's not that they're not able to learn, or in fact, many of them are looking for things that faith offers, but they don't know what we provide or how to connect to it. So we have to know what the different vantage point is to try to connect and adjust, like that party example, in order to engage them in a different or more meaningful way. So what does that mean? Let's go back to the party example. I asked for you to think about what we could do that wouldn't throw out our goals or our objective, but might adjust things and result in an effect that's going to reach more people or interact with people in a more meaningful way. So we could also ask the same question about what could we change to better achieve goals in our organization, right? Whether that be the things that are available to you that can be done differently with what you're doing in your role with Vincent de Paul or in your parish or in other places. And these are two examples that I want to give you of organizations that, given these changes in faith or these changes in generational experiences, are making subtle, small changes that aren't changing overall goal or objectives, but are resulting in a different way of engaging members. So I'm going to talk about the Knights of Columbus, and then I want to talk about the American Legion. So let me start with the American Legion. And to some extent, this is localized, so this may or may not be happening in your American Legion. There's some similar things happening in VFWs also. But the American Legion, the VFW, organizations such as those were really hit their heyday in a baby boomer generation and silent generation following World War II and throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, etc. But what's happened is that there are, first of all, less of a priority put on fraternal and social organizations now than there was before. But there are also just fewer veterans. There are fewer members of our society now who have been in the armed forces. So what the American Legion and other organizations similar have done is they've opened membership to children, grandchildren, and in some cases, great-grandchildren of those who would have qualified as members. I, for example, am a member of the Sons of the American Legion, though I myself would not be eligible for membership in the American Legion, but I'm eligible for membership in the Sons of the American Legion. They've been able to understand differences in generational realities and profiles, and they've been able to add a layer to their organization to still engage people in a meaningful way in their work without compromising their overall goal or objective. Similarly, the Knights of Columbus have run recently into some difficulty trying to recruit new members of a younger generation. The average age of Knights has really gone up significantly in the last 10 years, especially since COVID. So many Knights of Columbus councils are finding other ways to do trial periods. They're finding other ways to explain what the mission and purpose and value of the Knights of Columbus is to members of a generation that might not, again, have the same experiences and so might not be able to relate to the explanations that were given before. The Knights of Columbus also have done things. Now, if there are any of you who are members of Knights of Columbus or married to members, the example I'm about to give you might be controversial because I know some people love this change, some people hate this change. The Knights of Columbus also recently changed their uniforms. So when I was a kid growing up and the Knights had swords and capes and big hats, right, with feathers, the Knights found that especially for newer members where that wasn't necessarily their thing, it actually was a wedge that caused some men not to become members of the Knights of Columbus. They adjusted their uniform. Their uniform didn't have anything to do with their core purpose. So they didn't change the overall vision or purpose of the Knights, but they, again, were able to look from a particular perspective to say, what would make sense so that that objective and goal can still be met in a relevant way, and we can perpetuate the Knights of Columbus, right? So the question that I want to pose to you here, and then I want to stop and hear some examples. So this one I would like to hear some of the thoughts that are coming to your mind, is as you think about the work that you've done or the conversations you might have had or you've heard about, trying to reach out and engage folks who are younger or members of a younger generation in the work of the St. Vincent de Paul Society, what are some of the disconnects that you're identifying, or what are some of the challenges that you could name that you've seen or experienced in some of that younger outreach that you've attempted? Does anybody have any examples that you're willing to share? We've tried to reach out to younger participants, younger members, but we've experienced blank.
Both parents have to work, and so their time away from their children is greater, and they tend to focus on volunteering with sports or the PTA or where they're going to be with their kids.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great example. So there's a couple of changes in generational realities that are potentially at the heart of that example you gave. One is changes in terms, and again, I know I'm being generalistic, but changes in the availability of both parents. In my parish, maybe I gave this example in a previous conversation, but in my parish, we have a large organization called Christian Mothers, and they're aging out significantly. And they're trying to reach women like my wife to join. But Christian mothers, many of them, if not most of them, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, were homemakers and different schedules. And most of the women they're reaching out to now have jobs. So my wife was invited to go to the next meeting of the Christian mothers, and she said, "Sure, I'll go. I'm happy to go and hear what you have to say." And they said, "Great. We meet at 10 a.m. on Tuesdays." Right there, not going to be helpful when trying to reach out to someone who might be working, right? So that's one category that you mentioned. The other thing is different demands on parents now in terms of volunteer service through schools, through sports, through other activities that may or may not have been there before. So there's a volunteer capacity, but it might already be taken up by other obligations, right? Those are great examples. Anybody else have anything you want to add to that? What other types of generational roadblocks are you running into?
I would add to that. I would just say that I've seen a lot more young adults, I guess, just interested in like volunteering on the fly or not being able to be basically, just looking out maybe like 3-4 days versus being locked into something beyond that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes an awful lot of sense. The idea that they will volunteer if the opportunity is there and they're aware of it, but the idea of, great, can I have you come on the second Tuesday of January? That might as well be 40 years from now, right? There's not the same type of plan ahead. There's also not the same type of longer term commitment expectation that's realized. I would also add, and I don't know if this is what you also meant, Ed, but there are a lot of members of younger generations who are willing to do service, but don't necessarily want the responsibility of leadership. I will come to your event and tie blankets. I don't want to be on the committee or chair the thing to lead the tying of the blankets, at least not at this point in time. So that's another big difference too. Anything else? We'll take maybe one more.
How you reach out to them.
Yeah, just communication in general, right? Communication in general, and not only just the delivery method, but also thinking about how, so this goes back to, and part of the reason why I was wanted to dwell for a few minutes on the education and faith trends. The point of that is to say, if there's a different foundational experience, there's also going to be a difference in the prior knowledge or prior experience to understand the information that's being communicated. Let me give you an example. I use this example a lot, so forgive me if I used it the last time we were together. My wife, I grew up for most of my life in the parish that we are now members of. I went to our parish school where my 4 children go, or our oldest now is graduated from. So when I would get information through either the newsletter or however it would come home for us, I understood it differently than my wife, who grew up 2 hours away from where we are. This is an actual announcement that is given every year at the end of Mass in my parish. It's time again for our annual parish pilgrimage. If you're interested in signing up, call Deb. That's the announcement. And of course, you might be wondering, where are we going? When is it? Who the heck is Deb? How do we call her? Right? How do we get a hold of her?
I'm
All of
trying
these.
listening to this. I'm
Now,
listening.
that's an extreme example.
The visuals aren't much.
In many of the ways that we communicate, the example was given of how do you reach members of a different generation, but also when you do reach them, How do you make sure the information you're communicating is information they have enough contextual information to understand? Because to you, I'm not suggesting that the announcement I gave would be one that you would give. But to you, to the people who give that announcement in my parish, they know exactly what they're communicating. It's clear as day. But to somebody else without that other experience, none of that information adds up to a cohesive thought, right? So when we go back to that first slide, when I asked you to think about what do you tell people what you do? It can be really difficult because even, and Gail, I'm not picking on you in your example, but the example that you gave, me knowing something about the church, knowing something about volunteer organizations, like the things you mentioned make sense to me, even if I'm not really familiar with the Vincent de Paul organization. But someone who has less of that experience, it might not make sense to them whatsoever what you described in terms of what St. Vincent de Paul does. So even if we can get to members of different generations to provide them information, how do we explain it in a way that their limited prior knowledge is going to make sense of, right, is the point. So given this, with the time that we have left, we have about 13 minutes left or so. Let's think about this question. What could we change to better achieve the goals of our organization? There are some non-negotiables, right? We don't have the authority to, but also we're not about to change our mission, right? We're not about to change our identity, the core of our purpose and our commission and our charge to do what we do through the charisms and through the values that we espouse. That's not what we're looking at changing whatsoever. But in terms of lowering the barriers to entry, in terms of, I gave you the extreme example of the organization in my parish that wants more women to join, but they meet at 10 a.m. on Tuesdays. Well, if you're working, you can't be there. So lowering the barrier to entry means moving when the meeting is, right? What are the things that we can address, that we can think about, that can better relay what we do and who we are, that can more fully connect with a younger group that understands the different life experience or obligations they might be experiencing today. So let's take, there's a lot of things in that summary sentence I just gave. So let's think maybe just specifically about communication. Let's just take that as a section. We're just brainstorming, there are no wrong answers. What are some ways we could approach communication differently that would more fully, more meaningfully connect with members of a younger and different generation? What do you see? What do you guess? What do you hypothesize?
Texting.
Yeah, texting, and not just texting, but even just thinking about what are the platforms that you utilize, right? Now, not all of you have to exist in these spaces, right? But you really have to be present. Your communication needs to be present in the places, the communication places, where your potential new connections exist, right? If you want to go after someone who is a younger millennial, someone in their 30s or younger, chances are texting is something. Newsletters aren't going to do it, right? Certainly social media is going to be something that's required. Certainly information that's easy and pretty immediate to find on your website is something important. We have, and Gail, if you help me remember, I can send this to you. We have some reflection questions that we use with parishes to try to do a self-audit of their website. And the reason we do that is because sometimes we don't use our websites in the way that, so we're not as familiar with them, but they make sense to us But if we see them through the perspective of somebody younger, it would be helpful. Like, for example, if I wanted to know something about your organization and when your next meeting is or membership, how many clicks do I need to click, or how much do I have to scroll to find the information? No other website that I go to makes that information difficult for me to find. So if it's hard for me to find it on yours, I just assume it's not there. So all that is to say, yes, texting, yes, social media, but also being careful about our website practices. If I'm in a virtual world where everything is done online, I'm comparing subconsciously my experience on your website to my experience on other websites. And that's going to be really difficult. I mentioned before, the organization that I work for is under the umbrella of this publisher. One of the most difficult things we do every single month is improve our website where people can buy our music, because of how much places like Amazon change. And people are used to being able to buy things like they can on Amazon on every other website. And that's not how ours works, right? Similarly, for communication in our websites, that's a big thing too. So we've got texting and platforms. What other type of communication possibilities can you identify?
Well, like case management systems.
Say
So
more about that, Terry. What do you mean by that?
just instead of having like the binder that goes from this president to that president to that president, just have it, the case management system on a platform like Serveware or CMS.
Yep.
So then it's more accessible to the members, and then, you know, I think it allows younger people to feel like there's a level of efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and not
Yeah,
a,
I think that's right. I think it allows for that level of efficiency. And also, again, the part of the big point of this, considering from generational perspective, is what are similar things that they're already used to, or similar expectations that are already built in. Now, again, some things maybe you can't change, or some things maybe don't work to adjust. But for most members of the generations you're likely going after, school handbooks don't exist in a binder, right? If someone is on a school board or some other sort of group, they likely, everything is electronic. Oftentimes, certainly in workplaces, not just with the rise of work from home, but also just in the way we are in much more of a multimedia Zoom-based reality, very few people have binders with things in them any longer. So when all of a sudden there is something that functions that way, it doesn't make sense, or it's just out of the ordinary, or it feels like it's not for me. Maybe there isn't a way to change some of it because of record keeping rules or whatever it might be. They're not beyond learning, right? They're not typecast, they're not unable to learn. But if you remove the barrier to entry, what are they used to? How are they used to receiving information? How are they used to this handoff? How are they used to looking things up? Where possible, try to match it, and it's going to really smooth out those potential bumps in between. Go ahead.
I was going to suggest, like, I feel like maybe if national, or if there was some kind of standardized, very quick, like you're talking about, like a quick response. So someone is interested in becoming a member within a week or a few days or a day, you know, they're getting this, even if it's through email or something, and like, welcome to the society, blah, blah, blah. We're glad to have you. This is who we are. This is what you're joining. This is how you can get involved, you know, instead of like, oh, we've got a member who's interested, and now, you know, that name will go over here, and eventually they'll get the orientation, and eventually they'll get safeguarded training. And that, you know, 9 months from now, you might get inducted as a new member or something like that.
Right. Yeah. There's, and I know we're getting close on time, but there's so many things that in what you just mentioned, Gail, that I want to identify as separate and related considerations. One is that immediacy. The church doesn't do great at this. Many organizations don't do great at this, but you know, we still have many parishes where someone will. This happened to someone I know who's at a parish a couple dioceses away from me. Someone called the parish to say, "I'm interested in becoming Catholic. And the answer they got was, "Ooh, it's November. Our RCIA program starts at the end of August. So call back next May before the office closes for the summer and we'll get you signed up." That person ain't coming back, right? We're used to immediacy. You sign up for something on a website, you get that confirmation email right away. So there are ways and systems, many of which are free or very inexpensive, where you can design the communication flow. So someone expresses interest, this is the text of the email that they get right away, asking for this next moment. And a week from now, they get this message, right? So you can automate some of that. I think also, even, you know, as you were mentioning, the different phases or different steps of the information interaction, what really has to happen when? Does someone need to, and maybe they do, does someone need to do all of the form filling out and safe environment training and all that to start attending meetings or to start meeting with folks or getting some sort of background information? Can there be a way that if you can move to something more immediate, you're interested, let's get you in something right away, that's going to keep members of a younger generation connected. If it's a wonderful, we'll be in touch in 6 to 8 weeks, they're going to move on to something else that grabs them right away. Now, all of this being said, our next conversation really is focusing on, given all this, I know there was more information share this time, because it's to express this framework of why are members of this different generation different? Why do they function differently? And how can we start to see things from their perspective to adjust where possible the way that we do things, right? So next time we're going to continue this same conversation, what's available to us, but we're going to specifically look at what are the strategies that work. What are some things we could do to identify and then invite and potentially also onboard these targeted individuals who are, again, millennials, older Gen Zs, whatever those age groups are. So this was more of the foundational framework. So next time we can continue to apply it in these ways, but also look at identifying and inviting practices that work. So there'll be a lot more of that interchange. What I'd like to ask between now and next time is, as you're thinking about this question, what could we change to better achieve the goals of our organization, meaning expanding that outreach and that engagement? Think about that. And as you come up with something or notice something, jot it down, because I want to start our next conversation by saying, what other kind of communication strategies, what other type of possibilities might there be to lower that barrier to entry as we're looking at members of especially millennial and Gen Z generations?
So Matt, would you mind just showing an example of like the generational profile that I've seen before? Do you have anything like that? Just give people like a...
So for example, let me, I have a bunch of things here for Generation Z. I want to show you this one. So these are a bunch of things about Generation Z that, given all of those trends, these things are true, right? Members of Generation Z have been their entire lives used to finding what they need instantaneously. They've always had a smartphone. They've always had the internet. Google is older than they are, right? So therefore, the expectation is at the grocery store, on a website, right, at school, at work, they find it instantly, or the information is not important or it doesn't exist, right? An example of how all of these trends conspire to building a generational expectation that we have to consider. If they have a question, they go find an answer. If I went to your website, would I be able to, in an understandable, easy to find way, find information that answer my questions? Because I'll go online to find it before I would pick up the phone and call someone to ask. So if it's not on your website, you're expecting it to come to someone in person, it's probably not going to happen, right? Etc. So these are some of those things that as a profile would become characteristics because of those differences in trends like education, parenting, etc.
Thanks. Could you hop forward? There's 2 slides forward or something that I wanted to point out. Yeah, past that one.
this one maybe.
Yeah, like I think some of this, some of these
Yeah.
are applicable, like as we go forward and
Yeah,
consider
so the
them
big
more.
yeah, and we're gonna talk about all of these the next time. So I don't want to I
Give
know
it
we're right
away.
at,
Sure.
but I want to I'll just mention this because we're gonna start with these next time. Cultivating a relationship is huge, meaning before they're asked to do something, right? So a relationship can be interpersonal. Someone might say, oh, I know Terry, she works for St. Vincent de Paul, and then I find out what it is. Some of it also is just presence. It's in marketing, it's what they would call brand awareness. I know what the Mother Teresa's Sisters of Charity are great at this. There's a lot of people who don't know anything about the church, aren't believers, but they know something about the Sisters of Charity because they're distinctive and they're easy to spot and they get what they're about, right? So cultivating that brand identity, cultivating that understanding or relationship to the idea is really important. We're going to talk about invitation next time. How do you invite intentionally and individually? Again, barriers to entry. If you expect someone to know something, are members of this generation going to know it on their own? Are you expecting them to come at a time that is going to be difficult for them, given what life is like now? We already had some of those great examples of both parents working and other demands of school, etc. So how can we lower barriers to entry? Can we start with baby steps and have someone participate in like a, don't call it probationary period, or something like that. But is there a way where someone expresses interest? Boom, we can have you come to a meeting to see and experience something that's immediate, right? And that gets to number 4. What's that immediate engagement? Gail, you said it right. If your processes are such that it might be 9 months before someone's cleared to do something, for younger generations, that's just not going to work. There's nothing in their life or experience that works that way, and it's not going to work for them. It's going to be a deal breaker for the vast majority, right? So for all
Thank
4
you.
of these things, we'll be picking up with these and applying them to identification and invitation next time.
Matt, when is the next meeting?
We're going to set it in January, Terry, so I can let you know.
January? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, great.
Yeah, I knew we didn't have a date, but I knew we have a ballpark for that date. Yeah. So between now and then, in between getting, remembering to thaw your turkey and doing all of your Christmas shopping and things, think about, from the perspective of someone who you're reaching out to, those things you've already run into, those challenges, availability, busyness, etc. How might we, like we did with the example of the margaritas and the water park and the chicken, what is something we could add that would widen the engagement without taking us away from who we really are? No ideas are silly. We're going to start with that next time just to see where we're at and if anyone's had any sort of moments of inspiration between last time and next time. And then we'll start with these 4 things and in identification and invitation. So we'll apply all of this even more deeply next time. How do you go out and get those individuals to become engaged?
You. Well, thank you so much, Matt, and thank you for everybody for attending. It's great to ponder these things more deeply, and I know like it's the desire of a lot of us, right, to grow our conferences and grow our membership. So I'd be interested to hear your brainstorming going forward, and we'll see what you come up with for January. But Matt, did you have a closing prayer or anything you wanted us to end with, or?
Let's just take a moment again. In Thanksgiving for, I asked you to think about your ministry vocation story. So let's take a moment to call to mind all of those who are really instrumental in your vocation, in you becoming connected with the society, in you becoming connected in your parishes or the other ways that you serve the church. Remember them. Remember what they did, how they made space for you, how they saw something in you, how they invited you into this blessed work. Good and gracious God, we give you thanks for this time together. We give you thanks for blessing us with this call to serve you through the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. We ask that you be with us, that you bless us, that you give us the courage and the fortitude and the patience and the perseverance to do what we must in order to serve our brothers and sisters, in order to spread the good news of the society, in order to build up your church. We give thanks for our mentors, for all those who have been catalysts in our lives. We ask that you might be with us as we seek to mentor others, to be catalysts for others, so that in all things you might be glorified. We ask this in all things in your most holy name. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
All right, thanks. I hope everybody has a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Have a
Have a good night.
See ya. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Matt.